The Yukon is a harsh, unforgiving land, mostly covered by vast forests and rolling plains. Nature rules this place, reigning with a graceful yet unyielding strength. Those who challenge her rarely survive to tell their story, and unfortunately, this old saying seems truer every passing day. For almost a decade, I've served as a park ranger at Tombstone Territorial Park, a massive nature reserve spanning over 2,100 square kilometers. The park is home to a wide variety of environments, including thick forests, vast fields, icy lakes, glaciers, and geysers, offering some of the most magnificent views and unique experiences you can imagine. It's truly a breathtaking place, and I don't think I'd trade it for anything else. However, something strange is happening out here, something that's forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew. I've never been much of a writer, so please forgive me if my words are a bit rough around the edges. The truth is, I felt I had to write this down because the media certainly won't cover it. What's happening out here is something I believe everyone deserves to know. It all started about 2 weeks ago when a late-night visitor arrived just as I and my fellow ranger, Gunny, were about to head out for the evening. Out here, we use call signs to protect our real identities, so I'll refer to everyone by their call signs. Gunny and I had just locked up the main office cabin when the sound of a screeching engine echoed in the distance. A moment later, headlights appeared on the trail, and we saw a snowmobile speeding toward us. It was coming fast, and for a moment, I thought the rider wouldn't stop at all. Then, suddenly, the man slammed on the handbrake, and the snowmobile skidded to a halt under one of the exterior floodlights. The rider wore a torn orange applique jacket, and his helmet was cracked. He killed the engine, and I could see his wide eyes staring out from beneath his visor. The man dismounted the snowmobile with a thud, falling to the ground before quickly getting back to his feet. With his right arm, he yanked off his helmet, while his left arm hung limply at his side, clearly injured. The man stared at us, wide-eyed and frantic. In a panicked, frantic tone, he tried to explain what had happened. He said that he and his friend had been out camping for 3 days. He told us that they were attacked at their camp, and his friend was badly injured. He might already be dead. We tried to calm him down and asked him what had attacked them, but he only shook his head, begging us to save his friend. We brought him inside, where 2 other rangers started tending to his injuries. Gunny and I grabbed our rifles from the lodge, mounted up on our snowmobiles, and set off to find the injured man's friend. The area he pointed to was a solid 20-minute ride outside the park's recreational trails, an area popular with hunters. The cold wind sliced through our gear as we rode, feeling like sharp needles against exposed skin. We never got a clear description from the man about what attacked them. I figured it was probably a bear, a pack of wolves, or maybe a moose. Wildlife encounters aren't common, but they do happen out here. Still, something about the situation gnawed at me, a pit of dread that settled in my stomach and remained throughout the ride. Several minutes later, Gunny rounded a corner ahead of me and slowed down. I followed, my headlights cutting through the dark. Off to the right, I saw a campsite. We parked our snowmobiles and approached. The remains of a tent swayed in the breeze, and debris was scattered everywhere. Most of their gear had been destroyed, torn apart as if something had ransacked the site in a violent frenzy. The scene looked like something out of a nightmare, like a mix of a tornado and a horror movie attack. Gunny and I readied our rifles as we cautiously searched the area. The night was eerily silent, save for the occasional gust of wind rustling the trees. Within a minute or two, we found the missing man, but he wasn't as lucky as his partner. He was lying in the wreckage of his tent, his face pale and his body covered in blood. His chest had been gutted, and his internal organs were scattered across the ground. I felt bile rise in my throat at the grisly sight. I had seen my fair share of animal attacks and accidents in the park, but nothing like this, nothing that left a man completely eviscerated. Suddenly, I heard the crackling of branches coming from the trees on the other side of the trail. My rifle was raised instinctively, and I shouted into the darkness for whoever was there to show themselves. Part of me expected a person to step out of the woods, But what actually emerged was something far more curious. A quadruped silhouette appeared in the shadows, sporting a set of antlers. As it stepped into the light, it revealed itself to be a 3-point juvenile deer, probably only a few years old. Normally, deer are skittish creatures, quick to run at the slightest hint of danger, but not this one. It simply stood there, staring at me, and my heart leapt into my throat. Its antlers were bloodied, covered in strands of flesh and viscera. Its eyes, black as obsidian, appeared empty, completely devoid of any sign of life or intelligence. Gunny stood beside me, both of us clutching our rifles tightly to our chests. Time seemed to freeze as the three of us, man, ranger, and deer, locked eyes in a tense stare. At first, it was just several uncomfortable seconds, but then without warning, everything changed. Gunny and I both fired multiple shots, but the deer charged forward, slamming into Gunny and knocking him back several feet. He hit the ground with a thud. The deer swiveled toward me, and I fired another round, hitting it square in the torso. The bullet from my rifle tore through its heart, sending blood spilling out and staining the snow beneath it. The deer wobbled for a moment before collapsing in a heap. I rushed to Gunny, helping him to his feet. He had been gored in the shoulder, and there was blood, but thankfully, it seemed to be a glancing blow. We both stared down, bewildered, at the bloodthirsty creature we had just killed. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen. Normally, deer only become aggressive like that when they're cornered, but this one clearly wasn't. Not only had it killed the other hunter, but it had stuck around and tried attacking us as well. It was a behavior completely unlike any deer I had ever encountered. Gunny pointed out its eyes, and the mystery deepened. The deer's eyes were pitch black, completely devoid of any normal features. Deer eyes are typically dark, but they always have dark brown irises. Gunny shined his flashlight on the deer's eyes, and we could see there was no trace of any color at all, just empty black pools. We wondered if maybe the deer was sick, rabies or some other disease. Gunny joked that maybe it was the start of a zombie apocalypse, but I didn't find the idea nearly as funny as he did. With that in mind, we decided to leave the area quickly. If the creature was rabid, Gunny needed medical attention immediately. We made our way back to the camp, where EMTs were already on the scene, along with a police car. The other man, the one who had been attacked, was unconscious and strapped onto a gurney in the back of an ambulance. One of the EMTs began tending to Gunny, but luckily, it didn't seem like his injuries were too severe. Rabies is usually spread through bodily fluids, and since Gunny had been struck by the deer's antlers, the chance of him contracting the disease seemed unlikely. Even so, Gunny was loaded into the ambulance, and the team drove off. I stayed behind, and as I did, the sheriff gave me a curious look. "Did you find him?" he asked. I nodded and swallowed hard as I tried to figure out how to explain what we had witnessed. The sheriff's eyes widened when I described what we had seen. "It was a deer?" he asked, sounding incredulous. I nodded again, unsure of what else to say. Both of us stood there, confused, until the sheriff cast a long, thoughtful glance into the distance. "You ever heard of anything like that happening?" I asked. He scoffed. "Not unless it was cornered or rabid. That's some seriously strange behavior." He met my stare again, more serious this time. "Are you sure the guy was dead?" I nodded once more. There was no doubt in my mind. The sheriff paused, then sighed. "Well, we'd better go find him before the critters do." The trail was too narrow for trucks, so we loaned the sheriff and his 3 officers our snowmobiles so they could go and search the area. Gunny was whisked away to the hospital, and I stayed behind to wait for the sheriff. It was well past midnight when headlights finally appeared on the trail. I exited the cabin and met with the sheriff and his team. They all looked exhausted, their faces drawn with confusion and concern. The sheriff, too, looked perplexed. "Did you find the camp?" I asked. The sheriff nodded, but his confusion hadn't lessened. "We found it, but there wasn't anybody there. No sign of that buck you two shot, either." I was at a loss for words. Nothing about this made sense. They weren't breathing. The sheriff nodded and pulled out a cigarette from his pocket. He lit it, taking a deep drag, allowing the smoke to flow from his lungs and spiral into the cold breeze. Something probably dragged him off, the sheriff muttered, his eyes scanning the dark woods. I'll get a search team together, but we'll have to wait until morning. He tipped his cap to me, then turned to leave with his team. I stayed behind for a moment, but I didn't think anyone was going to get a good night's sleep that night. The next morning, the sheriff kept his word. By 9 a.m., he had gathered a massive search team consisting of 5 officers, 6 rangers, including myself, and about 24 volunteers from the town. The sheriff gave us a brief rundown of the situation, and soon after, we entered the woods. Spreading out in organized formation, we searched all day, covering as much ground as we could, but when the sun set, we hadn't found anything, just endless snow-covered vistas and silent woods. There was no sign of the missing hunter or the deer. Some members of the search team, especially the hunter's family, clung to the hope that he was still alive, lost somewhere in the woods. I didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. He didn't have a pulse. But I also couldn't explain how his body had just vanished from their camp. There are cougars, bears, wolves, and a few smaller carnivores and scavengers in these woods, but none of them typically drag their prey too far. After searching the camp thoroughly, we found a trail in the snow that seemed to indicate where the unfortunate hunter had been dragged away. The trail led about 50 meters before it ended abruptly. Several sets of animal tracks continued farther into the woods, but there was no trace of the corpse. Some of the tracks even appeared to be human footprints, but we couldn't confirm that. This left us with 2 very unsettling possibilities. Either someone else had been out there and they had carried the body off, or, perhaps more disturbingly, the body had been carried off by itself. The theory of foul play seemed to be the most plausible explanation, though the idea of a body moving on its own was obviously absurd. I had been on countless search and rescue missions in these woods, and usually the person is found without incident. But every so often, we encounter a situation where we find nothing at all. That's when it becomes truly strange. We returned to the camp as night began to swallow the trees. Everyone was disheartened and exhausted. The missing hunter's family was devastated by the lack of progress, and so were the rest of us. The chances of someone surviving in these sub-zero conditions for over 24 hours, especially if they were injured, were slim. When we returned to camp, the sheriff took a head count. Before he even finished, I realized someone was missing. One of the senior rangers, a man named Eagle, wasn't accounted for. I immediately tried to radio him, but there was no response. With a sinking feeling in my chest, I gathered 3 other rangers, Mazda, Penguin, and Whiskey, and we set off to find him, already fearing the worst. Eagle is an expert in these woods. He's been out here for over 3 decades. If there's anyone who knows the land like the back of their hand, it's him. He basically wrote the book on search and rescue protocol, and leaving the group behind was probably the last thing on his mind. The woods were unnervingly silent as we made our way deeper. They felt much more sinister now than they had earlier in the day. The gnarled, leafless trees seemed to reach for us with their skeletal branches. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every time the wind stirred, it sent a chill through my spine. Suddenly, a sharp cry from behind me caused me to turn around. Mazda was on the ground, rolling back and forth as something small seemed to be attacking him. "Get it off! Get it off!" he shouted. Penguin rushed to his aid, grabbing the creature that had been assaulting Mazda. He tossed it away, and we saw that it was a squirrel, which quickly darted back into the woods. Mazda's coat was torn, but thankfully he wasn't injured. Penguin helped him up, and Mazda tried to catch his breath. "You steal its acorns or something?" Whiskey asked with a chuckle, though it was clear Mazda was rattled. Squirrel attacks aren't exactly common here, or anywhere for that matter. "What the heck's going on over there?" A 5th voice called out from the left. We turned, and out stepped Eagle, looking just as confused as the rest of us. "Where have you been?" We were looking for you. Why did you break off? I questioned him, my annoyance clear from the edge in my voice. Eagle just shrugged, as if the answer was insignificant. Sorry, I thought I heard something, he muttered without further explanation, and without missing a beat, he walked past me, heading back toward the camp. The other rangers followed his lead, but something held me back. Silence, the kind only found in a cold winter night, hung in the air, thicker than usual. It was a silence I knew well, but that night felt different. As I stood there, staring into the dark, shadowy trees, I could have sworn something was watching me. We all gathered at the back of the cabin, where the sheriff stood at the center, preparing to speak. He simply thanked everyone for coming out and mentioned that the search would resume the following day. I called Gunny on my ride home. He sounded better than I expected, likely due to the painkillers, as his unusually cheerful tone suggested. I filled him in on what had happened, how we still hadn't found either of the missing bodies, and that Mazda had been attacked by a squirrel. After Gunny finally stopped laughing, he said something that struck me as interesting. Dang, first a buck, now squirrels attacking people? Someone must have really pissed off Mother Nature. At least Gunny's rabies test had come back negative, and he just needed time for the stitches to heal. We shared a few jokes, and I told him to get some rest, so we could hurry back to gather firewood for the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep well. In fact, I didn't manage to get any sleep until about 1 a.m. But when I finally did fall asleep, I didn't rest well. I don't remember the specifics, but I had some very intense dreams. I hesitate to call them nightmares because that word feels too cliché for me, but honestly, it's probably the best way to describe it. I woke up gasping, drenched in a cold sweat. Maybe it was the stress of the whole situation, weighing on my subconscious, but the anxiety wouldn't let up. Since sleep didn't seem like it was going to be an option, I decided to get up early and head into work. I thought I could get a head start and maybe even find the missing hunter. At this point, though, it seemed unlikely. As my headlights illuminated the parking lot of the cabin, I was surprised to see I wasn't the first one there. Eagle's beat-up Ford F-150 sat in the lot, gathering snow. I parked next to it and stepped out into the frigid morning air, shivering as a gust of wind brushed against the back of my neck. Eagle wasn't in his truck, so I figured he must already be inside. I hoped he'd had the courtesy to make a fresh cup of coffee, but the cabin was still locked and unlit. After unlocking it, I stepped inside and called out for him, but there was no response. Reluctantly, I took it upon myself to brew some coffee. Without it, I'm about as useful as a pair of lead underwear. As the coffee simmered, I took a more thorough look around the cabin. I thought maybe Eagle had just fallen asleep in one of the offices, but I didn't find him anywhere. On a hunch, I checked the key cabinet, and my heart sank. One of the sets of keys was missing. I quickly checked the shed and discovered that the matching snowmobile was gone. I stared out at the trail, but there was no sign of Eagle on the snowmobile. I couldn't understand why he'd go out there alone, and it left me in an uncomfortable spot. All I wanted was to sit with my coffee and wait for the others, but I knew I had to go find him. With an exasperated sigh, I washed out a thermos, filled it to the brim with coffee, and grabbed another set of keys. I fired up the snowmobile, burning the crap out of my lips as I took a sip of coffee, then hit the throttle. In a few seconds, I was heading down the trail toward the hunting grounds. It was the only place I figured Eagle could have gone. It was winter, and the sun didn't rise until well after 9 a.m. It was just past 6 a.m. then, and the darkness still ruled. My only source of light was the headlights on the snowmobile. Several minutes later, I was about halfway to the search area when I noticed something off to the left. The missing snowmobile sat alone at the edge of a small gully. I pulled up alongside it and killed the engine. The silence was overwhelming, deafening, and felt suffocating. The snowmobile was covered in a thin layer of snow, indicating it had been out there for a while. For all I knew, Eagle might have never left the night before. I thought about calling out for him, but I didn't. That same eerie, unspoken feeling gripped me, and breaking the silence felt like it would be a sin in itself. I'll be honest, everything inside me screamed to turn around and head back to the cabin, but I couldn't just leave Eagle out there. He could be hurt, and my conscience wouldn't let me abandon him. The snow crunched beneath my boots, sharp and loud in the stillness, like the sound of shattering glass, contrasting with the cold, quiet night. I reached the edge of the woods and peered inside, but the trees seemed to close in, blocking any view of what lay beyond. I thought I heard something snap in the woods, but before I could react, the cold took my breath away, and I hesitated, unsure of what came next. A twig snapped, or maybe it was a branch. It was hard to tell, but the distance was significant enough that it could have been a gunshot. With our distinctive sounds, it's well known that bears and humans are the only creatures clumsy enough to snap twigs. I looked around again, considering calling out, but I didn't. Another snap, this time to the left in the trees ahead of me. I tried to rationalize that it was just snow falling off a branch, but my nerves weren't convinced. Then came the rasping wail. The sound sent chills down my spine. It called out again and again, with a few seconds between each cry. After what was probably the fifth or sixth wail, I realized it was a fox. Dang, those things make some creepy noises, especially at night, I thought. And sure enough, a lone red fox popped out of the trees, about 30 meters behind me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and we just stared at each other for a moment. Suddenly, it lifted its head and let out a shriek, this time in a completely different tone, an odd, raspy snarl. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the fox darted back into the trees and silence returned. It didn't seem that significant at first, but then something strange gripped me, something I'm not sure I can even put into words. A series of powerful goosebumps rose on my skin, and the hairs on my neck stood up. My heart rate spiked. There was a strange scent in the air, copper and mildew maybe, and it was terrifying. It was as if some primal instinct had suddenly kicked in, setting off every alarm my body could muster. I turned back down the trail, trying to regain my composure. The moon had split the somber clouds above, casting an effervescent light down onto the ground, illuminating the snow. At the far end of the field, a blockade of pines stood, and within them, something was staring back at me. It was a bipedal figure, obscured mostly by shadow. Tall, gaunt, slender, and menacing, it almost looked human. I was too far away to make out any of its full details, but the impact was immediate. My body reacted instinctively, as though I was biologically programmed to fear it. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, its left arm lifted and its finger uncurled, pointing directly at me. I started to back away towards the snowmobile. The fox yelped behind me again, and I fired up the skidoo. As I did, the sounds of crows and owls reverberated overhead. More animals began to emerge from the woods. Squirrels, rabbits, deer, fishers, rats. Dozens of forest creatures, all converging on me. I didn't stick around to see what they intended to do. I hit the throttle, racing back toward the cabin as the forest seemed to come alive behind me. The sheriff and 2 of his men were there when I arrived. They turned as I came speeding back into the lot, killing the engine and quickly dismounting. The 3 of them eyed me in confusion as I struggled to catch my breath. "There's something out there," I managed to say between breaths. I looked at the sheriff, and his confusion deepened. "Slow down, son. What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone becoming more concerned. A stream of mumbled gibberish escaped me as I tried to communicate what had happened, but it was too jumbled to make sense of. Finally, I managed to get the most important detail out. "Eagle's gone," I gasped. The sheriff's eyes widened, and almost as if on cue, a familiar yowl echoed in the distance. It sounded just like the same fox I had seen earlier. This time, I saw it again, standing in the trail. Its eyes were hollow, like dark, bottomless sockets, and they glinted with an unnatural malice. I stepped back from the others, and they seemed oblivious to my apprehension. The sheriff eyed the fox warily, but it didn't break its stare. Then, more sounds emerged, chirps, growls, and wails, a chorus of animal noises that grew in intensity. One by one, animals began to emerge from the thicket, eyes like pure obsidian, filled with malice. The sheriff took a step back and pulled his pistol from the holster, the other cops doing the same. The creatures continued to close in. Suddenly, there was a loud grunt, and a massive shadow came charging out of the trees. Its hooves slammed into the ground, kicking up dirt and snow as it gained speed, its formidable antlers lowering like a battering ram. It was a bull moose, and before any of us could react, it was on top of us. The sheriff fired several rounds, but the bullets barely fazed the enraged creature. A 9mm against a full-size moose doesn't do much more than annoy it, and in seconds, the beast slammed into the sheriff, launching him several meters backward. He hit the snow hard, groaning from the impact, while the moose scraped its hooves along the ground, snorting in fury. The other cops began to fire at it, but it did nothing to stop the moose. However, it did seem to make it retreat momentarily. I scrambled to the sheriff, who groaned in protest as I tried to help him to his feet. I managed to get him inside his SUV, and he handed me the keys. But as I rounded the front of the vehicle, I saw a shadow leap onto one of the other cops. He screamed as a tomcat dug its claws and fangs into the nape of his neck. The other officer rushed to his aid, but he was set upon by a horde of small creatures, crows swooping down, pecking at their faces, while wild rabbits, squirrels, and chipmunks nipped at their ankles. I was about to leave the truck and try to help when a badger slammed into the hood of the vehicle, its vicious claws and fangs slashing at the windshield, trying to reach me. The thud surrounded us as countless animals attacked. There was only one thing left to do. I hit the gas. The truck roared to life, flinging chunks of snow behind us. I could see animals tumbling off as we swerved away, their screams echoing in the night. The badger finally tumbled from the hood as I skidded to the right. "Go back." "I'm not leaving them," the sheriff commanded, though in his broken state, I knew he couldn't help. I was conflicted, torn between fleeing or turning back to help. Nature made the decision for me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the familiar silhouette again. The moose slammed full force into the passenger side of the vehicle. The windows shattered, and the frame crumpled on impact. The force was so immense that I felt the truck rock on its axles, and before I could react, it tipped over and collapsed onto its side. My head slammed into the window, and my vision blurred. In my momentary delirium, I saw the light of dawn beginning to break on the horizon. A cacophony of sounds filled my brain. Screams, the moose's snort, and the animals retreating into the woods. I felt the moose's gaze on me, and its antlers poised to tear me to pieces. But then, there was an odd whistling noise, like the sound of a harsh winter wind playing through a clarinet. Strange, piercing, and otherworldly. The moose lifted its head, as if alerted by the sound. It shot me one last, disdainful glance, then turned and trotted away. I heard the animals fleeing as well. The pain-stricken groans of the other officers surrounded me, but my focus was on the sheriff, suspended in the seat above me. He was barely conscious and bleeding. I managed to orient myself and kick out the windshield. I crawled from the wreckage, still dazed and in disbelief at what I had just witnessed. One of the cops was standing by the other vehicle, clutching his chest with his right arm, while his left arm had been torn clean off. His face was scratched and scraped beyond recognition. We regrouped, and though his condition was bad, he was the lucky one. His fellow officer lay a few meters away, his chest heaving with labored breaths. His face looked like it had been shoved into a blender, and his torso was worse. There was nothing we could do for him. Less than a minute later, the wounded officer stopped breathing. He then attempted to radio for backup, while I tried to rouse the unconscious sheriff. A few minutes later, a cavalcade of police vehicles, ambulances, and civilian cars arrived at the grisly scene. They rushed the sheriff and the injured officer into an ambulance, while the remaining officers stayed behind to try to make sense of the madness. That incident occurred almost a week ago, and things have shown very little improvement since. The sheriff and his fellow officer are still in the hospital, suffering from multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and other severe injuries. They have yet to find Eagle or the other hunter who started this whole fiasco. A day or two after the attack, Tombstone Park was shut down indefinitely. Although the shutdown has not been officially posted online, anyone who tries to enter the park is turned away without explanation. I do not know who exactly is responsible for taking control of the situation, but it is clear they are handling it with full authority now. 2 days after the assault, while I was recovering at home, I received a knock at my door. 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in identical black suits, greeted me and asked if I would be willing to answer some questions. They refused to identify their employer, which led me to turn them down initially. However, they assured me that I was not in any legal trouble and provided a document confirming that. They then leveled with me and told me that people were in danger and that they could use my help. I agreed and told them everything I have written here today. I asked them who they were and what was going on, but they avoided giving me a direct answer and instead asked me more questions. They did not reveal much while I retold my account of the events, and as quickly as they arrived, they left without saying another word. The past few days have seen multiple residents of the town report hearing gunfire late at night, followed by the arrival of Humvees, armored trucks, helicopters, and even an Abrams tank. It is clear they are not taking any chances with whatever is out there. I ran into one of the agents from this mysterious group that has invaded our town the other night. He was hesitant to speak at first, but after I bought him a few drinks, he loosened up a little. I assumed they were Canadian government operatives, but he denied that, claiming instead that they were part of a private security company called Misnomer LLC. Essentially, they are mercenaries, but with some truly impressive equipment at their disposal. I asked him what was happening out there, and he admitted that things were not exactly under control. Apparently, 3 people had died earlier that day, and the attacks seemed to be escalating. He mentioned that larger animals had since joined in: cougars, grizzly bears, wolves, elk, polar bears, and others. He also said one person claimed to have seen a Bengal tiger out there, but no one could confirm it. Furthermore, he told me that some of the creatures they encountered were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, things that had not yet been discovered by science. He mentioned that a large, hairy, bipedal creature had crushed the skull of one of his men the previous night. They didn't get a good look at it, but it was clearly much larger and faster than anything they had encountered. He also told me that something had taken down one of their helicopters, and no one had any idea what it was. When I asked him what they were dealing with, he didn't have an answer. He said, as far as he could tell, the local wildlife had become infected with a disease, possibly a mutated strain of rabies or prion. He explained that during the day, the animals behaved normally, but at night, everything changed. He confirmed that he had seen the obsidian eyes of the creatures, just like I had. However, I do not believe his theory. I do not think this is a disease at all. If it were, then surely Gunny and the other wounded officers would have contracted it as well. Maybe the disease lingers dormant in a host for a while, or maybe it is yet to become capable of infecting humans. But I have another reason for thinking this is not the result of some contagion. The way the animals behaved did not seem like they were sick. It was as though they were determined, almost vengeful. The way the bull moose reacted to that strange whistling sound and retreated, along with the other creatures, made it seem as though they were being commanded by something. It was like they were soldiers in a forgotten army. Their attacks were premeditated, coordinated, and ruthlessly efficient. This leads me to believe that something is organizing them. There is a group of First Nations people called the Athabascan who have lived in these lands for countless generations, long before Canada ever became a country. They have a legend about something called the Kirikti, roughly translated as the one who hates. I have a few Athabascan friends, and they have told me that this creature is a malicious spirit. No one knows where it comes from, what it wants, or how to stop it. According to the legend several hundred years ago, it slaughtered entire tribes in this region, corrupting animals to follow its will. They say it could have easily wiped out the entire continent, but it simply stopped, fading into folklore. Even now, they refuse to speak its name, fearing it may attract its attention. The more they told me about it, the more I was reminded of the thing I saw in the woods. It has to be it. Every time I think about it, that overwhelming sense of dread returns, making my stomach churn. I cannot ignore the feeling that creature gave me. I do not know if I believe in superstitions, or if that thing is really the Kiriti or not. For all I know, it could be an alien, a Wendigo, or some other supernatural entity causing all of this. I suppose it does not really matter what I believe, because something out there killed one of our rangers, and a good friend, Eagle, deserved better than what he got. All the victims did. As for now, the situation has quieted down a bit in the last few days. The animals have not launched another attack, and that could mean one of two things. Either the creature has been defeated, or it is preparing for a large-scale attack. Pray for us, and hope that the second theory is wrong.